This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you say too much. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it might be, people come flocking, and usually with a lot of trash and loud music. This particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon, a pretty simple overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but at last minute he canceled, and he left me on my own. So with a packed bag and a car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time and some trouble navigating rough forest roads, I didn't arrive to the trailhead until around 5:45, which for those of you who don't backpack, this is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast. So I figured if I moved quick enough, I could get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and get a camp set up. With only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot, but there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but it didn't look recent. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood, and I got the fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked an open can of chili mac I had brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good. My camp was set up and my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike had almost gone away, but it was still there. The side effect of camping alone in a remote area. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything in the edge of that circle, and past it, are pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating my dinner when a small rock, about the size of a marble, was thrown into my camp. I looked in shock, as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light on, and towards the area where I had seen the rock come from, but due to the density of the pines and the brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned in the tree line that surrounded me, searching for whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray too far from my fire, that in hindsight offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock, or it had fallen from a tree or something. I went to sleep that night not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I awoke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely inaudible if you weren't listening for them, but they were there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened, as the rustling of leaves got harder to hear, as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got as I came to realize that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of those few moments in my life where I've almost crapped my pants. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away, in the tree line of the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand, and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options. Stay here and wait out the night, or attempt the 3-mile hike back to the car, in the dark. I figured that whoever was out there with me was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light. So I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night. Eventually, whoever it was came back. I could hear them walking around the woods. It was far off, but I could hear them. It sounded like someone leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll, without a care in the world. Sometimes they would walk so far away, and I would lose the sound of their steps. But then, an hour later, maybe 2, they would return, still faint. This went on for 3 or 4 hours until I listened to the steps get closer and closer, until they were about 7 feet away from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small, as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped, and everything went totally silent. I sat there still, for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand, and prayed that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and speed-walked the 3 miles back down the trail I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked, and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in, and drove, and didn't stop until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read what someone had written in the dust on my back window. Sleep well. A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and the scariest by far. There was somebody seriously deranged in the woods that night. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can.
I go to an all-girls boarding school, and there are 9 junior and 4 senior boarding houses. The junior houses are for girls between 11 to 16, and the senior houses are for girls 16 to 18. At the beginning of September 2016, I moved out of my junior house into my new senior house, which, for the sake of not bringing my school into this, we'll call Robinson. Robinson was different from the other houses in that you only stayed for a year, but that you stayed with another person in a double room, as opposed to the single rooms like other senior boarding houses, and I chose to share with my best friend, Georgia. For various reasons, I ended up going back to school 2 days early with only a handful of other girls. I get told to go to my room, and I discover that it's in the basement of the house, tucked into a corner with 2 other rooms. The minute I was in the room, I felt something was off, like really, really off. It was like there was this nasty aura in the room, like I wasn't alone in the room. I'm really into ghost stories and the paranormal, so all those stories started to kick in. That being said, I have pretty bad anxiety, so I told myself it was that and tried to ignore it. I unpacked, and since Georgia isn't there yet, I get to pick which one of the beds, which desk, and which drawers I want. I chose one that's on the far side of the room, with the end facing the open doorway that leads to the space where you can either turn right and go to the toilet, or go left and go to the door to the rest of the house. This room is absolutely huge, so I can space out my stuff, and I'm pretty happy about it. At about 9, I decide that enough's enough and I should go to sleep. I turn the main lights out and get into bed and try to go to sleep and pull the duvet over my head. I then proceed to spend the next 5 hours absolutely terrified. That feeling that something's in the room is amplified 1,000 times, and it's made worse by the fact that I can hear things, shuffling in the dark, soft scratching on the carpet and creaks of people sitting on wood. I'm absolutely sure that I've heard someone breathing near my head at some point during the night. I'm so terrified that I have to psych myself up to even change position, sure that something will jump onto me. I'm exhausted in the morning, and when I finally woke up, I realized that although it's not as strong or as powerful as during the night, the feeling that something is in the room with me is still there. It's awful, like something is hanging onto my back and waiting for me to turn my back so it can jump at me. My roommate comes back about 3 days later, and I notice she hardly seems to notice the atmosphere in the room, which seems so painfully obvious to me, and happily puts away all of her stuff. That feeling that there's something in the room was honestly terrifying, I couldn't study in silence. I had to have music on so that I could attempt to block out this feeling, and I always left my phone on with YouTube videos playing when I had to go to the toilet, just to make me feel like if I came back out into the room, I wouldn't have to see something standing in the room, silently waiting for me. It sounds really stupid, but it was the only way I could reassure myself. The feeling that I was being watched was always most clearer at night. It's probably because I was on my own and didn't have anything else to do but try and go to sleep, but whatever reason, it genuinely scared me. I'd asked in other rooms in the house. There are 4 floors in total, including the basement, and been into other rooms, and it feels like a nice normal room, and nobody in them ever felt like they were ever being watched. The worst place where it happened was the open doorway, the one that my bed faces. In the beginning, it was easy to ignore, the feeling of being watched only happening every now and then, but as time went on, it got worse and worse. At the worst, it felt as though a grown man was standing in the doorway, barring the way, staring at my bed, and it was as though I could physically feel the presence there. It was so strong. One night, when it was particularly bad, I tried to shrug it off and get to sleep. I have a habit of bringing up one leg to my chest for a bit and then bringing it back down. That night, I brought my leg up, felt the presence, brushed it off, and began to lower my leg back down. As I did, to my absolute horror, I felt the edge of the mattress sink downwards, as though somebody had suddenly sat on it, and I felt what felt like a hand resting on top of my foot. Straight away, I brought my legs to my chest and curled up like that for the rest of the night. I was really on edge from that, so for the next few weeks I made sure to check the doorway before to reassure myself that there's nothing there. About 3 weeks later, Georgia and I are talking about a play we both like, and since our beds are on the opposite sides of the room, I sometimes couldn't make out what she was saying. Anyways, Georgia makes some point, and I couldn't hear what she said, so I turned over from my position of facing the wall and lift up the duvet to face her bed. I lift my head, and I see a dark shadow above her desk of drawers, floating above the books she has on top of it. We had the curtains open, so a shriek of light from a street lamp was shining through the window into our room, since our windows open out onto the car park, and in it, I could see the shadow was in the shape of a head and shoulders, with the head facing the window, all in pitch-dark shadow, so I couldn't make out any features but what seemed to be a prominent Roman nose. I freaked out, yanked the duvet over my head and faced the wall. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be there. It really set me off, and since then I got really wary of something actually being in the room, and there are 2 other incidences that occurred and convinced it for me that something was in the room. The first was when I was under my desk, looking for some socks to wear to dinner, and as I dragged myself out of the desk, I reached behind me for my jumper and glanced to see where it was. And as I did, I got a glimpse of a light blue woolen peacoat standing directly behind me, just above my shoulder, so close that I saw the way the light glinted in the buttons, and I could only make out just that the arms of the coat were inside the pockets. I stood up as fast as I could, and I saw that the coat, and presumably the wearer, had vanished. I didn't even hesitate and just legged it out of the place, and refused to go back in for another hour until I knew that my roommate was back in the house. The worst incident was also the last. It was Sunday morning, and we're allowed lie-ins. I was asleep when suddenly I became aware of the fact that I was asleep and lying in bed. I suppose it's what you could call a lucid dream, but I'm not sure as it's never actually happened to me before. I didn't have enough time to focus on it because next thing I knew, there was a feeling of something being near me, and then a feeling that something was by my head, and I felt a presence standing by my head, leaning over me, so solid that it felt like another human being was right there, even through the fog of my sleeping mind. I didn't have enough time to realize what was happening until I felt a hand, a solid, warm human hand, touch my head and the bit just under my ears and start to stroke it. And I swear to Christ and back again that a voice began to make a noise in my ear, like a weird moaning sound, or like someone was sobbing with their mouth closed, muffling the sounds of sobs. I wasn't sure if it was real, but I sure wasn't taking any chances if it wasn't a dream, so I twisted myself away from it and screamed out loud, "Georgia! Georgia!" Georgia bolted up and looked around as I tore my covers off and looked around my area. She looked really confused as though she hadn't seen anything, and I thought that maybe it had been a dream. until I noticed that my wall calendar that was pinned up to my notice board above my head had been ripped off the wall and was lying on the floor by my bed, despite the fact that it was definitely pinned up securely the night before. It never got as bad as that again. The feeling of being watched slowly began to stop after that, and the negative aura in the room and the small sounds I would have heard in the night started to stop as well. And when I came back from the Christmas holidays in January, it was barely here. The presents had all but vanished, and it felt like the rest of the dorm rooms in Robinson. Over Christmas, I decided to do a bit of research into Robinson to figure out what could explain what was going on. I found out that Robinson has been a hotel before my boarding school had purchased it, which is why the rooms were so big and why they still had ensuite bathrooms, and you could actually still see the old wallpaper that had been painted over in some of the rooms. The town where my school was a really big place for spying and espionage during the Cold War, and it still to this day has strong links to British espionage, and this hotel was very close to places where this would have definitely occurred. The coat I saw matches exactly the kind of coats worn by the Navy during the 1960s. So from what I gathered, and since getting information about the detailed workings of the British government during the 60s is kind of difficult, I like to think that maybe it's the ghosts of someone who lost their life in my room when it was still a hotel during the Cold War, and they're still stuck here, waiting until they can pass on.
This happened a few years ago. I haven't touched any technology after what happened until now. So I've been using tech since I was a kid. When I was 12, I learned how to write scripts and programs to hack into systems, and ever since, I was hooked. In my second year of university, I was quite good at hacking, albeit somewhat cocky. Throughout high school, I had made a lot of money hacking. People would come to me to recover their hacked social media accounts, or to hack into their boyfriend's phone to read their messages. I was known as the go-to guy if you wanted something hacked. Even my school would occasionally come to me for help. Like I said, I made a lot of money back in those days. Halfway through my second year of university, I started getting bored of this. The money was good, but there was no thrill anymore. One of my friends told me about this cool thing called the dark web. I had heard of the dark web before, but it never really seemed that interesting. My friend told me about how it was full of drugstores, weapons dealers, hackers for hire, and a bunch of fucked up porn sites. As a hacker and a stoner, the dark web seemed right up my alley. When I got home that day, I fired up my computer and did some quick Googling. With my vast knowledge of technology, it didn't take me long to get set up with Tor and Tails installed on my computer. I browsed through the hidden wiki, finding most of the websites boring or dead. I texted my friend asking if he had any interesting link directories. He replied, "Here are a few of the ones I use." He then sent me 5 links. I decided to click on the second one and see what I could find. I scrolled through the directory for a few minutes. He was right about how interesting the dark web was. I couldn't figure out where to start, so I clicked on a chat room. The website looked old and primitive, but surprisingly there was one person online. I started talking to him. He seemed kind of shady. But this was better than just scrolling through a bunch of dead websites. He said he had been on the dark web for a while. Finally finding someone with a vast knowledge of what's on the deep web, I asked him if he had any interesting links. He sent me a link, then immediately left the website. I had no idea what was hidden behind that link. I wish I hadn't clicked on it, but at the time, my own curiosity overwhelmed me, and I clicked on the link without giving it a second thought. After it finally loaded, I was presented with a pop-up box. It said in red text, "If you don't know what's next, you're probably in the wrong place." There were 2 buttons, Continue and Leave. I instantly clicked Continue. Biggest mistake of my life. It brought up a black screen with a blood-red title at the top, The Freak Show. A message popped up.
Hello.
Interesting website you got here.
Thank you. Are you here for the show?
I thought to myself, what show? Out of curiosity, I replied, yes.
Since you are a first-time viewer, it's going to cost you 500 Bitcoin. Future viewings are free.
From all the money I made hacking, I had enough to fuel my curiosity, so I went ahead and paid the $500. After paying him, I was given a zip file instead of a link. I had developed a custom-made antivirus that appeared to work very well, so I took the risk and downloaded it. When I unzipped the folder, there was 2 files inside, an installer and a file named README. I started by opening the text file. It just said,
Do not send the installer to anyone, or else.
I went ahead and closed the text and opened the installer. It took about 15 minutes to install, which is strange for my computer. After installing, it opened up automatically. Across the screen it said,
Hello, welcome to the Freak Show. We use custom program for our streams instead of live streaming on tour due to the slow speeds. We also need the extra security.
After about 10 seconds, the screen changed. It was now a countdown, with a chat room next to it. At this point, I was starting to feel that whatever happened next would not be good. The timer displayed that there was 30 minutes until the stream started. I set my screen name to James Kent 157, not my real name, but I needed an alias. I said hi in the chat, but was ignored. I waited the 30 minutes, and after the timer hit 0, a video feed began. On the screen there was a guy in a mask with 3 people side by side in front of him. He started speaking with a voice changer.
Welcome to the Freak Show. We're happy to see all of our old viewers and a few new ones. We will now randomly choose one of you to tell us who to kill first and how to kill them.
At that point, I realized I was fucked. I was in too much shock to close the window. I watched as the feed turned into a bunch of names scrolling, until it landed on someone named Gore725. I watched as he typed out his horrific demands, which involved stabbing and dismemberment, and finishing him off with hot metal. I watched as the sicko did all of this. I watched as the victim screamed in pain. After everything was said and done, he said,
Now, who's next?
After he said that, I snapped out of it and went to close the page. When I clicked on the X, it said,
Sorry, no leaving midstream.
I was trapped. The randomizer popped up again, and this time, it landed on my username. I couldn't respond. Instead, I typed in the chat, You sick fucks! Why are you doing this? I was met with all the people in the chat calling me names like pussy, dumbass, retard. I then said, I'm calling the police. That was a big mistake. The owner of the site then said,
Call the police, and you'll be in the next stream, Logan.
That made my heart freeze. He knew my real name. He then pasted my parents' names, my address, school, age, and IP in the chat. I immediately pulled the plug on my computer, and my screen went black. I then ran to my parents' room and told them what happened. They called the police, and they provided us with protection. Within a few months of investigation, they found the website's owner. He was a 32-year-old man who lived off a combination of welfare and the money he made from his red room. It was many years later before I finally started using technology again. The dark web is an abyss of terrible things, and if you're smart, you'll stay the hell away from it.
Like all women, I have a fair amount of creepy experiences with men. I have a whole host of stories I could tell here, but one of my more memorable stories happened when I was a student. For context, I went to university in France and spent a few months doing an internship in Paris, where this encounter took place. I was only 20 years old, and so, it being a Friday night, I was on my way to meet some friends at a restaurant. The apartment I was living in was in close proximity to a couple of metro stops, and the line I needed was a few blocks away on a pretty busy street. When I was only a block from the stop, a guy looking to be about my age suddenly approached me, asking me if I knew where the metro stop was. I indicated the large yellow M glowing above the stop on the corner and thought that would be the end of our conversation. Instead, He fell into step with me, explaining that he wasn't from the city and didn't know the train lines too well. I said it was no problem, and he gave me a funny look as he asked, "You aren't from here, are you?" I thought. He was right. French is my second language, and although I've spoken it from a young age, I still have an accent on a few words. Normally, I don't mind having an accent or people remarking that I'm not French, but when a guy you just met on the street one night comments on it, it can make you a little uneasy. I confirmed, though, that I wasn't French, and we actually ended up having a decent conversation as we walked to the metro stop, down the stairs, and through the turnstiles. During that first, and what would turn out to be our only conversation, he seemed nice enough and didn't set off any red flags. I told him where I was from and what I was studying, and he told me that he was in the city visiting some friends. We ended up getting on the same train, though even then I questioned whether he was actually going the same way as me or not, and kept talking until my stop. Right before I got off the train, he asked for my numbers so that we could meet up sometime, and, in a move completely out of character for me, as is talking to strangers, I did. Big mistake. He texted me that Sunday, asking if I wanted to meet up on Wednesday. I agreed, but then he asked if we could meet at Châtelet. For anyone who doesn't know, Châtelet is an enormous metro stop near the center of Paris. Several metro lines run through it, as do other trains that go out of the city proper. It also connects to a huge shopping mall. When he asked this, I started to feel uneasy. My intuition told me that there was something wrong with wanting to meet up in a place that had so many ways in and out, a place where if you got on a certain train or were forced to do so, no one could find you. My mind tends to jump to worst-case scenarios, but my gut is never wrong. In any case, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, as he supposedly didn't know the city that well, so I told him that Châtelet was pretty big and it might be hard to find each other in there. I suggested meeting up at the bookstore in the connected mall, still a public place but less hectic, but he didn't seem to like the idea and stopped replying to my messages. The next day, Monday, I was on my way to a meeting with my boss when my phone buzzed and I saw it was a text message from him. "Can you call me now? Another message came in. Or can I call you?" My intuition spoke up again in the back of my mind, telling me that something still wasn't right. I replied, "I'm going into a meeting right now. Let me get back to you." With that, I turned my phone all the way off and didn't turn it back on again until after the meeting was over and I was on the bus home an hour and a half later. Turning it back on, I almost dropped it as it started to buzz uncontrollably with several dozen text messages loading simultaneously. I only scanned them, there being so many, but they seemed to range from proposing that we meet at a friend's house on Wednesday night to "Why won't you answer? Where the F are you?" followed by a number of missed call notifications, all from his number. My intuition was doing more than pinging at this point, so when his number popped up on the screen again, I turned the phone off again until I reached my apartment. Once again, I dared turn it back on and saw even more missed texts and calls from him. Pretty spooked at this point, I shoved the phone back into my purse and made dinner, not even looking at the phone until well after I had eaten. Once I could stomach it, I took the phone out of my purse. I felt a shiver go up my spine as I saw that he had called me no less than 16 times, and that his text messages had become more and more vulgar, before ending with a final, "Fine, I guess this isn't working out. Maybe I'll see you again. Goodbye." I've never blocked a number so fast in my life and immediately called my mom. I could barely hold the phone again, though this time it was because I was shaking so badly. To this day, I can't help but feel that I dodged something extremely dangerous, more specifically, someone who was probably just looking for a girl to take advantage of and jumped at the chance when he met a young foreign one in a big city. I'm still not sure what possessed me to give him my number, but I console myself with the fact that I didn't tell him I was living near that metro stop where he approached me. I just have a feeling that he might have come looking for me. The lesson that I have taken away from this incident, aside from never giving my number out ever again, is to always trust my gut. She saved me before, saved me that day, and will most likely do it again.
This happened to me back in the summer of 2018. Just thinking about it now still gives me chills to this day when I consider what could have happened to me that night. I'll start by giving a little backstory. I'm a 24-year-old male who lives in Minnesota. I was staying with a friend who lives in Chicago. We've been friends since sophomore year in college, so I was really looking forward to catching up with him since our departure after graduation. I was only visiting him for a week, and then I would be on my way home. During the evening, my friend, who we'll call Steven, and his mother went out to go get food, and I decided to stay behind for the simple fact that I just wanted to get settled in for the night. However, the house became extremely hot, so that's when I decided to get out of the house and go walk around the neighborhood. Now, something that you should know about me at this point is that I'm a frequent walker, especially at night. It really calms my nerves whenever I'm on edge, or when I just need to get away for a while. I'm a really antisocial guy in a way. After about 10 minutes of walking, I came across the neighborhood park, and just to kill some time, I decided to go explore it. This park was massive. There was a baseball field enclosed by a walking trail that went on for about a mile, and there was also a small basketball court. In the distance, I could also see a small playground area for children, along with a dimly lit bathroom that you would typically see at any community park. The creepiest part was the trees that surrounded the area. Even though it was a park, it kind of put you in the state of mind that you were standing in the middle of a forest preserve. I didn't have any fears about walking around this park at night, because Steven always assured me that his neighborhood was safe for the most part. "Nothing ever happens here," he would always say. But he was mistaken. I decided to keep walking, and I eventually came across a small park bench, so I decided to sit down and enjoy the night breeze for a little bit. I was at peace when I suddenly heard a rustling noise coming from the nearby trees. I quickly turned around, and there was nothing there. Might have been the wind, a bird, or maybe a squirrel, I thought. After about 5 minutes of relaxing, I pull out my phone to see a text from Steven. It read, "Hey, we just got back. Where are you?" I was about to respond when I looked up to see a car pull in near the playground a few yards away from where I was sitting. This was pretty odd, seeing how it was about 9:30 p.m. But I didn't know much about this area, so I dismissed it as being completely normal. A few minutes go by, and I thought that someone would exit the car, but they didn't. It was at this point that I started to feel a little on edge. The headlights were irritating me, so I got up and started walking back to Steven's house. I texted him saying, "I'm on my way back from the park." In that moment, I heard a car door slam behind me, and I looked back to see a very large man. He was standing in front of his car, and it looked like he was staring right at me. Now keep in mind, it was pretty dark at this point, so I can't really describe any of his facial features. I began walking again, picking up my pace and looking behind me every few seconds. The man was now following me, and I was growing paranoid. "I don't want to die tonight," I thought to myself. Suddenly, I noticed out of the corner of my eye, 2 men emerged from the trees in the darkness. I was almost at the entrance of the playground when I heard, "Hey, sexy, come here a minute. You want to have some fun tonight?" I was scared shitless at this point. Adrenaline started to kick in, and to this day, I still believe I did one of the stupidest things I've ever done. I turned around to face the men head on and yelled, "Fuck off! I'm not in the mood for games tonight." At that moment, a large hand covered my mouth from behind, and it was suddenly harder to breathe. I tried to scream, but the gloved hands just held me tighter. I started to feel lightheaded, and everything turned blurry. I then blacked out. I woke up in a car, still feeling lightheaded. My hands were tied, and my belt was unbuckled. I immediately noticed that all 4 of the car seats had men in them, and I was sandwiched between 2 of them in the back seat. "What's going on?" I said in a hoarse voice. "We're going for a ride," the driver said. I felt weak and sluggish as I desperately tried to move my body, but a sharp blow to the side from one of the men sitting beside me stopped me in my tracks. There was no way I could fight 4 guys bigger than me. I started begging for them to let me go, and they responded by just laughing at me. Tears ran down my face as I struggled to get my hands free. But it was useless. I felt nothing but fear and anger and overall embarrassment. The car started to back out of the parking lot, when suddenly there was the sound of the back window glass breaking. 3 of the men immediately got out of the car to check it out. "What the hell just happened?" one of them yelled.
"You sickos let him go now!"
I recognized the second voice as Steven. With the car doors open, I took the opportunity to escape, desperately stumbling onto the pavement. I looked up to see Steven holding a rock in one hand and a tree branch in the other.
"I already called the police on you fuckers,"
he said. I started to gather my strength and joined my friend in the standoff. We were outnumbered, but I wasn't going to let him fight these men on his own. He was like a brother to me, and where I come from, you protect your family. In the distance, we heard the sound of sirens. The men quickly hopped back in the vehicle and booked it out of there fast. I immediately noticed the car didn't have any license plate. I'll skip through the police details, because it was just the usual. They took my statement and told me that they would let me know if anything happens. The week passed without further incident. The day that I was getting ready to go back to Minnesota, I was trying to block out everything that happened as best as I could, when Steven said, "You could have been Michael." "Who's Michael?" I asked. He then told me that when he was in middle school, he had a friend named Michael. They used to play together all the time at that playground. One day a stranger approached them. The man claimed to be a friend of Michael's dad. To make a long story short, he never saw that man or his friend Michael ever again.
This incident occurred sometime in the fall of 2006. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had fairly dense woods located directly behind it. As a child, I had a passion for exploring. I especially loved exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Prior to this incident, I had wandered through those woods many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular that I frequently enjoyed to climb, usually about to the halfway mark so I could perch myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to the peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploring, I carefully scaled my favorite tree. I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Naturally, being late in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes. I always felt a little saddened to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like my own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home, so not to be stranded out there after dark. After watching the sun set until I could no longer see it, I began my descent down the tree. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name. I thought nothing of it at first, as this routine had occurred plenty of times before. Then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods, rather than towards the entrance where she always stood when she called me home. My mom had never entered those woods before, at least not with me. I was eager to find her and show her all of my favorite spots before it grew too dark. That's when I realized something was off. How could she have gone into those woods ahead of me? Certainly I could have missed her, but as I said, she never entered those woods. She continued calling my name, but there was something strange about it. She sounded absolutely frantic, almost angry. Fearing that I was in trouble for reasons currently unknown, I froze in place. As her voice drew closer, I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine exactly how angry or upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly I heard her voice calling my name from the direction of my house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods yet again, it wasn't an echo. I wasn't imagining things. I was literally hearing her beckoning me from the edge of our backyard, as well as ahead of me. My legs suddenly turned to jelly. I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. "Come here, right now," the voice that I originally believed to be hers screamed from just ahead. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawing closer. I didn't question which voice was actually my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that unnerved me. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could possibly carry me. It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste. Even though my house wasn't very far away from me from where I was standing, those woods had never seemed larger to me than they did in that moment. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now sounding desperate. Panic set in as my actual mother finally came into view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods and in the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped foot into my backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safely inside the house with our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods. Appearing confused by the question, she told me that of course she didn't. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she had heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was also no. Although I was still very much shaken up, I managed to explain everything that happened as clearly and rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have imagined it, that I was spending too much time out there by myself. The incident in those woods had stayed with me to this day. I can still hear this voice as clear as a bell. Whoever or whatever is calling my name sounded exactly like my mother, but I know it wasn't her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange in a way that I still can't fully explain. I didn't go back into the woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out for very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seemed entirely plausible. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could have pulled it off, not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt that it was anyone else because, as I stated before, we lived in a very rural area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known my name and where to find me? We've since moved out of that house, but my mother and I occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard or saw anything unusual out there. I know it probably shouldn't, but what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that day and never had anything out of the ordinary occur. The best explanation I have at this point is a doppelganger or possibly a demon, but I'm unsure. If anyone has a possible explanation as to what might have happened, I'd love to hear it.
This happened when I was 23. I am a small female, and this story has changed my life. It was almost midnight when I got off of work at my job as a chef. The town that my restaurant was in always bustled with activity. The bars and diners were always packed. I climbed into my dented-up Ford Taurus and turned the key. Immediately I cursed myself for not getting gas on my way to work. There was no way I was going to make it home on less than a quarter of a tank. Irritated, I pulled out of my spot and onto the parkway, driving towards a popular chain gas station. When I pulled up to fill my tank, there was an eerie silence that hung over the gas station. I was the only customer there, which felt strange. I popped open my tank and started pumping fuel, annoyed that it was taking so long. another car pulled up and parked at the pump right next to mine. It was an odd choice, since there were at least 8 unoccupied others to choose from. Turning away from the car, I finished fueling and closed the door to my tank. There was a cheesy song blaring over the speakers, so I didn't realize that a man had walked up behind me. I turned around and was startled. I then took a few steps back. The man smiled. He wasn't much older than me. "Can I help you?" I asked. He was standing in front of my driver's side door, blocking me from climbing inside. At first, he just looked at me and said, "Pretty thing like you shouldn't have to pump gas by herself. You should get your man to do that for you." My blood ran cold. He knew that I was alone. My car windows weren't tinted, so it was obvious that no one was with me. "Out here so late all on your own?" he went on, dragging his finger over my door handle. I tried to not let him see that I was terrified, and kept his eye contact. "My husband is at home, and he's waiting for me to get back from work. It was nice to meet you. You have yourself a good night." I bluffed, taking a step closer to the man, indicating that I was ready to get back into my car. "Sure, honey." As soon as he took a step back, I lunged into my driver's seat, shutting the door and locking it behind me. The doors to the man's car opened, and 4 other men climbed out, and my entire body started to go into shock. I realized that they may try to kidnap me. The first man pounded on the hood of my car as his friends started trying all of my door handles. Fear came over me as I grabbed my phone to call the police. However, all I saw was a connect charger message flash on my screen as the phone shut down. "Oh no! Oh my God, no!" I screamed. "Just leave. Just whip out of here and lose them," I thought to myself. I turned my engine over, and that's when the men surrounded my car, trying to use their bodies to block me from driving away.
"Bitch, get out of your car."
One of them screamed before punching my window.
"We're not gonna hurt you."
Like I would believe that. I took a deep breath and put my car in drive. I didn't want to have to run over someone with my car, but if I absolutely had to, I would. I inched forward, and the men tried to call my bluff by not moving. "Looks like this is going to be a game of chicken," I said to myself. I then moved my car forward even more, until they all scattered and climbed into their car. I took the opportunity and screeched out onto the parkway, almost getting T-boned in the process. I didn't know what to do. They had pulled up behind me and were now following me. If I drove home, they would know where I lived, and I had no idea where the police station was. I had a tank full of gas, so I decided that I would just drive until I lost them. I was too afraid to pull over at a business and try and seek help, and I couldn't outrun their car. So I did something that my dad would have yelled at me for. I decided to drive towards the woods, out to my grandmother's place. She lived in the middle of nowhere, and I knew of a few back roads I could take to try and shake them. So the chase began, them trying to run me off the road and tailgating me so close that I swear I heard our bumpers touching. Blood was rushing through me so fast that I was afraid that my eyes would actually burst out of my head. We made it to the windy road that led to my grandma's. If you aren't familiar with this road, it can be lethal, and that's what I was counting on. Them not knowing every twist and turn by heart like I did should slow them down. The speed limit was 35, and drops down to 20 when you're going around turns. There wasn't a single chevron in sight to guide these stalkers around the turns. I pushed the gas and brought my car up to 65, which was the maximum speed you could go driving down this road. I took each of the sharp turns furiously, constantly keeping an eye on my rearview mirror. I was gaining quite a bit of ground on them, and noticed that at numerous times they almost went off-road. I wasn't even using my brakes, for fear that the lights would warn them of each turn. I was afraid that I would actually die in a wreck, but anything was better than what these men had in store for me. I finally came to the one-lane bridge, cutting off a car coming from the opposite direction. This forced my pursuers to stop, as the other car came between us, making its way down the bridge. This was it. It was my opportunity to completely get rid of them. I drove down a long gravel driveway and killed my lights, pulling my car beside a parked pickup truck. I held my breath as I waited. A moment later, the car that was following me sped by. I counted to 10 and pulled up to the mouth of the driveway, watching their taillights vanish around a turn. I punched it and sped back the way I came from. I almost wrecked at one point for not keeping my eyes on the road. Finally, I lost them. I made it home around 2 in the morning. I pulled my car into the garage and locked all of my doors. Remember to always have your phone charger in your car. You never know when you may need to call the police.
It was my 11th birthday on March 2nd, 2012. I was a big fan of Selena Gomez, and I wanted one of her CDs for the radio my grandpa had bought me a few months prior. Anyways, my grandpa took my sister and I to Target after he got out of work to buy me a Selena Gomez CD I've been begging for. At this time, Target in my area had a small food court with a snack bar with Pizza Hut in it, which I always got when I went shopping there. My grandpa and sister and I, we all ordered our miniature pizzas, the personal pans. Then we sat down at the table with our food, which happened to be right by the register. After the worker gave us our pizzas, they headed to the back to clean up, I assume. So it was just my grandpa, my sister, and I in the food court. Everything was good for about 5 to 10 minutes while we were eating. But then I noticed my grandpa, who was sitting across from my sister and I, look behind me. He moved his eyes side to side as if he was watching somebody. I, with my heart racing because I was so confused, turned around, and that's when I seen the most disgusting and creepy looking man I've ever seen in my life. He was tall, maybe about 6'2" to 6'4". He was partially bald, had dirty stained clothes, and he smelled like pee. He was right behind me, going back and forth, eyeing my grandpa. And that's when my grandpa started to yell at the guy, telling him to get away. My grandpa then stood up and said, "If you don't get away from my granddaughters, I'm going to make you get away." And that's when the guy backed up, and he just stared. My sister and I then got up, and we quickly rushed over to the other side of the table where my grandpa was. We started to walk away, and that's when I heard the guy say, "You're very beautiful. Where are you from? You must be from the islands like Fiji or something like that." I turned around and he was looking straight at me. Then he pointed and said, "Yeah, you pretty girl." That's when my eyes got wide, and my grandpa rushed my sister and I down the aisle to get away from this guy. He was following right behind us, saying his name, along with his address, telling me that I could come visit him sometime. My grandpa kept a hold of my sister and I, making us go down different aisles to lose him. When we finally did, we quickly purchased the CD and went out to the car. When we got into the car, my grandpa was driving out of the parking lot, and we saw the guy walk out of the store looking around like he was looking for us, or specifically looking for me. He didn't see us, as we were already driving away. But I was completely terrified because that was something I've never experienced in my life before. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but I seen that guy one more time after that. 2 years later, when I was 13, again, I was with my grandpa, but it was just him and I. We were leaving my grandparents' house, and we got into the car to head to the mall. As we were at the end of our street, we seen the guy again, walking down the street. I stared at him wide-eyed, and we made eye contact, which made my heart drop in fear. He then immediately started to scream as soon as he saw me, and tried to run after the car as my grandpa drove off, but of course he didn't catch us. Later on, when we got back to my grandparents' house, I had found out there was an insane asylum right down the street from my grandparents' house at the time, which is where we believed he lived, since the address he gave matched the address to the place. I'm 19 now, and I never saw that guy after the last time when I was 13. And I'm really glad I didn't because he was seriously ill.
When I was 12, I remember one Friday night, and there's no way that I could ever forget it. My older brother and I were picking up snacks and drinks at a little convenience store for a party that we were holding that night. My brother had me wait in the car while he ran inside to get the chips and whatnot. This happened in the 90s, so cell phones were not really a thing yet, especially for a 12-year-old. I remember abruptly looking up and seeing a man's face peering into the window inches from mine. He had glasses on and looked intelligent, but creepy. He smiled, and it was obvious right then that there was something very off about him. I could tell instantly that his intentions were not good. He said hello, and then asked my name. I gave him a false name, and then he said that his name was John. I gave a nervous and forced smile, and it became increasingly awkward. I looked past the man, hoping to see my brother walking over to the car, but I was filled with disappointment. He was still inside the store. The man, or John, as he said his name was, then asked me if I lived nearby. This was such a red flag that I was almost speechless and just replied, "Not really." He kept a very creepy smile the entire time. I looked over his shoulder again and thankfully saw my brother walking towards the car. Just then, John tried opening the door. Thank the Lord it was locked. I don't remember locking it, but you can bet your ass that I was glad that it somehow was locked. I didn't have time to react, and John immediately walked away after the door didn't budge. My brother walked up seconds later and asked who the hell that was. I was shaking and told him that I had no idea. Nothing else happened that night, and the party was great, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but think that this guy was trying to kidnap me. However, about 2 years later, I saw the guy on the news. He was captured and sentenced to death for murdering 3 teenage boys. Sound unbelievable? Trust me, I have trouble believing it myself. 30 years. I'm from Belfast, Ireland. I have a large friend group, and we would always have sleepovers at my house. This is the story of how one campout in my back garden went wrong. I live in a nice neighborhood, mostly with old people in it. It was around Easter, and in my school, we get a week and a half off for Easter break. Just before school ended, we decided to have a campout in my back garden because I recently got a new tent that could fit probably my whole friend group into it. It was the Saturday after we finished, and we all met up at my house around 7 o'clock. We ordered pizza, made marshmallows around the fire, and all in all, we had fun. At around 12:30 a.m., we all decided to crawl into the tent and play some card games, as it was getting quite cold outside. I dealt all 13 decks, and we began a game of Jack Change It. After around 5 different card games, we all ordered some food and climbed into bed to wait for the food to arrive. We got a text message saying that it would be there in around 40 minutes, so we all could relax for a while. The food came, and we all went outside to sit around the fire and eat it. I have a large back garden, and we were at the bottom of it, so we weren't afraid of waking my parents up by singing and talking loudly. After finishing our food, we got back into the tent and decided to get some rest. When everyone had drifted off to sleep, I was awoken by a strange sound. A sort of whistling sound. I brushed it off as being me dreaming, but around 2 minutes later, there it was again. Every 2 minutes it happened. I woke up my friend and told her to listen. Right after I said that, there was a different kind of whistle, and it came from the other side of the tent. This was when we decided to wake everyone else up. After around 10 minutes of listening to the whistling going back and forth, we heard footsteps coming from behind the tent. The crunching of leaves made us all fall still. We counted to 3 and broke out of the tent sprinting. All of us ran as fast as we could to the back door. Once we were all in, we locked it and looked out the window. We could just barely make out 3 people standing in the garden, looking up at us.
I'm a female in her 30s. I was born and raised in Gainesville, Florida. About a decade ago, while I was still in college, I would often take babysitting jobs to make extra money. I usually would watch Mrs. Gruder's 2 young boys named Ashton and Samuel. They were twins and were very well behaved. It was always a pleasure spending the night with them. This was around late October on a Friday. Right after my class let out, I went straight over to Mrs. Gruder's place. She and her husband planned on going out of town for a few days, and I was to watch over the twins until their aunt came over on the following day. This worked out well for me, because the boys and I would usually watch TV in the living room until around 8:30, which was when I was to put them to bed. I planned on spending the rest of the night studying for the upcoming mid-semester exam. After I put the boys to bed, I was working on my laptop in the living room, when suddenly, that eerie feeling of being watched came over me. I tried to shake off this feeling, but I became increasingly uncomfortable. It got so bad that I had to get up and look out the back patio door. When I looked out, the only thing I saw was an empty backyard. But something did catch my eye. Towards the fence that separated their yard from the neighbors was one of those old metal swing sets. I remember Mrs. Gruder mentioning at some point that it was left over from the previous owners of the house. There were only 2 swings on the set, and one of them was rocking back and forth, the way it would if someone had just gotten up from it. When I turned back around, I was nearly startled to death to see that Sam was standing directly behind me. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. After stopping myself from going into cardiac arrest, I asked Sammy what he was doing out of bed. His response made my blood turn to ice. "The woman with no head is keeping me up. Can you please tell her to leave?" I was floored to hear him say that, especially after experiencing that uneasy feeling while I was studying. But my rationality took a hold of me, and I told him that he just had a bad dream. But he asked me to come with him back to his room and stay with him until he fell asleep again. Of course, I obliged him. I adored Sammy, and I would have done anything for him or his brother. When we got back into his bedroom, I was surprised to see that Ash was sitting up in bed. As soon as he saw us, he asked his brother, "Did you tell her about the woman that was in here?" Sam responded, "Yes, but she thinks I was having a bad dream. I didn't know that you saw her too." I was immediately put on edge. If Sammy was just having a nightmare, why did Ashton see the same thing? I tried my best to convince the boys that because they were twins, they shared a special connection, and when one of them would have a bad dream, the other could sometimes feel it too. I didn't believe my own words, but I didn't want to bring up the word ghost because I didn't know how their mother would react to me explaining to them what a ghost was. I decided to stay with the boys and read them a bedtime story until they fell back asleep. Once they were both snoring again, I made my way back into the living room. I immediately noticed that I never closed the blinds above the patio door. As I approached the door, a stranger stepped into view. It was a woman wearing an old-fashioned dress. She appeared to have no color to her. She looked like she came right off the screen of one of those old-timey black-and-white movies. She did not look like someone who was living in the 21st century. The woman stared daggers at me. I could feel the hatred behind her cold eyes. What happened next is something that I still try to convince myself didn't happen, but my memory is just too vivid for me to be making this up. The woman's head did a 360 and then simply fell off her body. I remember putting one hand over my mouth to stop myself from screaming. The headless apparition remained standing, even after its head fell off. I know that what I'm about to say will make no sense to anyone listening, but I could still feel the woman's cold stare, even though her head was now gone. The image of the headless woman faded from view, and I quickly closed the blinds and made my way back into the boys' bedroom. I slipped under the covers with Sammy, and stared at the bedroom door until I eventually passed out. I told no one about what I saw. It wasn't until I got into my car after the boys' aunt came to relieve me that I had a complete nervous breakdown. I never told the Grooters what I experienced, because I didn't want to risk them switching babysitters. I cared too much about Ash and Sammy to allow something like this to prevent me from ever seeing them again. I continued to babysit for the Grooters, until the twins were old enough to look after themselves. The Grooter house was located in a pretty unremarkable neighborhood. It was about as normal as you could get. Paranormal activity was the last thing I ever expected to experience there. Gainesville has quite the history, so I'm pretty sure there are more than a few restless spirits wandering about. And although I never went through anything like that again, I would still sometimes see one of those old swings rocking back and forth in the dark.
This story didn't actually happen to me, rather to a close friend of mine. He told me the story a few hours ago and I wanted to share. He lives in Hayward and was attending a march for the BLM movement at around 4 p.m., I think. I don't know which streets or anything specific like that. He had just sent me a couple of videos of the crowd marching and taking a knee. So, after about 10 minutes, he said that they were passing through a street lined with shops and alleyways. There was an older man sitting on a curb by one alleyway watching the march. Jordan describes the man as looking upper 40s, wearing a black and white flannel shirt and jeans and a cap. Jordan had the misfortune of walking nearby said alleyway, and the man stopped him, saying something along the lines of what he needed help fixing his passenger seat since the recliner handle was broken, and it was a two-person job to get it back into its upright position. The man gestured towards his car, which Jordan examined. It was a black Chevy Malibu that was parked in possibly the most sketchiest part of the alley, right towards the back, kind of hidden behind a trash dumpster. Jordan declined and quickly walked away before the man could say anything else. Now, for his sake, I wish the story ended here, but I wouldn't be posting it here if it did. I think sometime later, like an hour maybe, Jordan decided to start heading home while the march continued. He says he was cutting across some field that was in between houses where only 2 other people were in sight, and as soon as he emerged at the other side, his air was suddenly cut off as a thick arm wrapped around his throat and began aggressively yanking him backwards. Of course, Jordan yelled as loud as he could, and thankfully the aforementioned 2 guys began to rush to his aid, shouting at Jordan's attacker. The guy let go and pushed Jordan. As Jordan stumbled forwards, he spun around and saw the guy who had asked him for help with his car, hopping into the Chevy Malibu and speeding off. The 2 other people asked Jordan if he was okay and comforted him and whatnot. Keep in mind that Jordan only told me this over a few texts, and I haven't gotten a chance to talk to him in public about it, so some details were spared. I think Jordan contemplated calling the police but didn't think it was worth it. He told me that they were probably already busy enough and he might be ignored or have an extremely long response time, to which the only info he had was a description of the guy. He hadn't gotten the guy's license plate. Jordan went home, and that's pretty much all he told me so far. It might sound cliché, but please, everyone stay safe. These are terrible times, and with all the looting and protests, stuff like this is bound to happen in the shadows.
I am an immigrant from Belarus. English is not my first language, so I apologize if I phrase things differently. Here's some backstory. I was only 11 when my family left the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. My father was involved with the Communist Party and would frequently visit Moscow when I was a boy. I don't know all the details. I don't even know what exactly my father's role was in the USSR, but from what I understand, we were granted asylum in the United States and had to flee Belarus in 1991. But that's not really why I'm writing this story. This is about something I saw in my childhood that has scarred me for life. This took place roughly a year before we left, so I'm guessing the year was 1990. My family, like many others, lived in a massive apartment building in Minsk. There were 2 other identical apartment buildings adjacent to ours, and directly behind the buildings was a playground area where I would play with my friends Sasha and Victor. Beyond the playground was a section of trees that separated a shopping plaza from the apartment grounds. I remember that my mother was feeling ill and was bedridden, and my father was away on business in Moscow, so I was pretty much on my own that night. I remember that I had gotten bored watching TV in the living room and decided to go outside and see if any of my friends were at the playground. I would say this was around 8 p.m., and it was dark out. By then, most of the children were inside, and I don't even think anyone was allowed on the playground at that time, but I didn't care. There was no one around to tell me to go back inside, and I was pretty excited to have the playground all to myself. It was chilly out that night, but it was not snowing, so I figured that I would play on the slides and swing set until I either got bored or if security came along and told me to go back inside. So there I was, just swinging in the dark, when I heard something near the fence that separated the trees from the playground. It was a strange noise, like someone was sawing wood, but there was something just off about it. I ignored the sound, but it became louder as time passed, to the point where I became curious as to what was causing this strange noise. There were no lights at the playground itself, but there were lights mounted to the back of the apartment buildings that illuminated things just enough to where you could see your surroundings. But the trees beyond the fence were pitch black. I got off the swing set and approached the edge of the playground. The sound continued getting louder, even as I got up right to the fence. It wasn't until I let out a curious, "Hello?" that the noise ceased. I stood there staring into the dark trees, waiting for a response, but all remained silent. After about another minute passed, I innocently asked, "Why are you chopping down trees in the dark?" I then heard a shuffling from within the trees, and soon I saw a dark figure come into view, but did not step out from the tree line. What happened next is something that still makes me want to vomit out my insides. The dark figure then threw something. The object flew over the fence and hit me directly in the chest. I was knocked backwards, more out of surprise than the actual force of the impact. "Hey, why'd you do that?" I shouted, but before I could get another word out, I caught a glimpse of what had been thrown at me. A severed human arm was lying on the ground in front of me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran back towards the apartments, bawling my eyes out. I stormed into our apartment and sat on the living room couch to collect myself. I did think about waking my sick mother and telling her about what happened, but decided against it. To give you some perspective, my mother grew up in Siberia, and she could be quite ruthless at times. Not only would she not be too happy about being woken up, but she most likely wouldn't believe my story. And I probably wouldn't be able to sit down for a week if she found out I left the apartment alone after dark. So I kept this incident to myself. As a child, I understood that what happened was scary, but I had no grasp of the implications. I thought there was a monster in the woods who ate people who came out after dark. Now that I'm an adult, there are some things that I've come to realize. For our remaining time in Belarus, I never saw or heard any kind of investigation regarding a missing person or a mutilated body being discovered, which is nothing out of the ordinary living in Soviet society. The monster in the woods, hiding in the trees that night, was most likely a sadistic madman dismembering a human body with a hacksaw. There is one more thing that I should mention. For the rest of the time that we lived there, I cannot for the life of me recall ever seeing my friend Sasha again after that night.
My friend and I both planned on watching our high school basketball team playing a really big tournament game. He lived literally less than a mile from the arena where the tournament was being held. We both agreed that 5 o'clock was a good time to go walk over there together as we both didn't have a car. And that was a good time to get good seats as the arena would be packed around 6:30. Around 4 o'clock that day, I was at the shopping center that is about 2 blocks away from his house. 4:35 rolled around, and I started to leave the shopping center and walk my way over to Shane's house. On the way there, I had the sudden urge to piss, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold it. It felt like an eternity, but I arrived at his street at 4:45, and I felt like my bladder was about to explode. As I got there, I realized how spaced out the houses are from one another, so finding a private place to urinate seemed impossible. However, I finally found a very large bush in front of a house that was for rent around half a mile down from Shane's house, and I looked around for anyone that would be standing around. Nobody was there. Relieved, I began to use the bathroom. I hear someone from a short distance walking. Embarrassed, I quickly zipped my pants up and looked back. It was an older man, probably around mid-50s to early 60s, about 5'8" and 150 pounds, wearing an outdated style pair of overalls and a red baseball cap. He was staring at me intensely, as if he were mad at me for some reason, while walking in my direction. I began to walk in the direction of Shane's house, which was the direction that the man was coming from, and I was passing him. I realized that he had 2 little boys with him, both around the ages of 10 to 12, along with a dog that was attached to a leash. I didn't think much of them until I heard a door swing open aggressively and someone yelling, "Hey, come back here." I looked back and saw that the man was armed with a rifle. He started running toward me, and I instantly started running faster than I thought humanly possible. He was about 2 car lengths behind me, and I could see Shane's house coming up. I looked back and saw my life flash before my eyes when I saw him starting to point the rifle at me and fire a shot that barely missed my left side. I yanked Shane's door open and slammed it shut, locking it in the process. Shane came running from his room, asking if I was okay and what happened. I told him everything while out of breath from running so much, and he was freaking out. Shane ended up reporting the incident, and when the police came back, they found no one. The man was gone. It turns out the house was up for rent for the past 6 months at the time, and has been vacated since then. I gave them a description of the man again, and that was that. Surprisingly, Shane wanted to go to the basketball game anyway, but I didn't want to go anymore. However, I didn't want to just leave him there by himself, so I reluctantly went. Shane and I ended up needing to get a ride, as we both knew it wasn't safe to go outside and walk over there. It was getting a little late out there, and friends were waiting for us to show up at the arena. While we were there, I had a hard time enjoying the game, as I couldn't shake off the fact that I could have lost my life back there. And if it wasn't for Shane's front door being unlocked, I probably wouldn't be here.
I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated and in a good neighborhood, but the security isn't extremely tight. Sometimes the gates are left open and anyone could piggyback off of someone else entering the access code. Maybe twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins and other items being stolen from porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So this particular Friday evening, I go to bed at about 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble getting to sleep, so I put on a podcast to listen to and eventually start to doze off. I become aware of a noise that sounds like a clicking sound, but it sounds like one of my upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kinda zone this out, as I'm used to my neighbors staying up late on weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realize the noise is extremely repetitive and getting louder. I then start focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from. Suddenly it hits me. It's coming from the entrance to my apartment. I leap out of bed and head to the foyer. I identify the noise right away. The lock mechanism is moving back and forth rapidly, like someone is trying to unlock the front door. I can hear that an object is inserted into the lock and the person is jimmying it back and forth with a lot of force. I instinctively turn around, head to my bedside safe, unlock it with a combination, and pull out my .357 SIG pistol, load a 14-round magazine, and chamber a hollow-point round. I head back to the door, and as I exit the bedroom, I see the lock twist and unlatch. I immediately pointed my weapon straight ahead, knowing that if someone comes through, I will have to make a split-second reaction. I decide that if someone comes through my door, I will give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they do anything other than that, or enter aggressively, I'm going to shoot and ask questions later. They don't enter. However, because I had also locked the deadbolt inside only, when I first moved in a year prior, I remember thinking that the deadbolt was a great security feature, and I got in the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life-or-death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the keyhole. On the other side are 3 Asians, 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 are wearing hoodies, so it's difficult to make out their faces. The men have objects in their hands, but I can't make out exactly what. The 2 men are talking back and forth, probably trying to figure out why they can't open the door, even though they have successfully opened the outside lock at this point. The woman is also talking loudly behind the 2 men, such that anyone in the hallway would be able to hear her voice. She's talking in another language. The only words I can make out are blah blah blah, apartment 250, blah blah blah, and she keeps repeating that over and over like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I start to wonder for a moment if maybe they're just drunk and have the wrong apartment number. But that's impossible. To open my lock, they would have to have a copy of my exact key or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or even given it to anyone. And here's the other thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, but, as I figured out later, that apartment number doesn't exist anywhere in the complex. Standing back from the door, I take a long broom handle and jab it hard in the face of the door, letting them know that I'm on the other side. They immediately stop fiddling with the lock and take off running. I debate whether to call 911 and decide against it until they return. I know they'll be long gone by the time anyone gets there. It would be too risky to follow them to try and get a better description or license plate, and I don't have enough identifying info as it is to make an arrest. I filed a police report the next day and let the apartment management know. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and ask for a police presence for a couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but that's not a surprise to me. It's been 7 months since this happened and no further incidents. Nobody else in the apartment has reported anything similar happening. I don't think they'll be back, but one precaution I took was to buy a smart lock for the deadbolt, so I can leave that deadbolt always locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that the deadbolt was the only thing between myself and an armed confrontation with intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in those situations until it really happens, but I can honestly say I am proud of how I stayed calm and was mentally prepared to defend myself. If there's one good thing that came out of this, I feel confident that I responded the right way and was ready for the unthinkable. It was probably only after my close call that my mind really started to run away with what could have happened were it not for my dog. I'm a 26-year-old female. I live with my fiancé, my 2 cats, and my dog Rowan. Our house is literally less than a minute away from a huge farmer's field that is frequented by many dog walkers at all times of the day. Me and my significant other often take turns walking Rowan around the field throughout the day. It was only around 7:30 p.m., and it was still really bright and sunny. Rowan was letting me know it was time to go for a walk, so while my partner was tinkering in the garage, I grabbed his lead and headed to the field. Let me quickly tell you about Rowan. He's a 2-year-old Rottweiler who is very loving and playful, if a little daft, but would not hurt a fly, not a bad bone in his body. He's also extremely well trained. We made sure to put the effort in, as he's a big dog breed with a bad rep, so wanted to make a point of not feeding stereotypes. I'm very much of the opinion of there's no bad dogs, just bad owners. Unfortunately, we've had some run-ins with some not-so-good owners, so Rowan gets a little nervous when meeting new dogs and people, but we're working on it. Now back to the story. We're walking around the farmer's field. Rowan is off sniffing and peeing on every blade of grass in sight. I always keep an eye out for other walkers anyway, due to Rowan being a little nervous, and I clocked a guy on his own, walking down the path towards me fairly far away. At first I thought nothing of it, as plenty of people walk this route without dogs. We were just coming out of lockdown in the UK. As the guy got closer, I noticed he was in a full tracksuit with the hood up, which was odd, as it was like 23 degrees, so shorts and a t-shirt weather. He then took a small path off the field leading through some bushes. It was a public-made shortcut rather than an official public footpath, but it was well enough used, so I kept walking, thinking nothing of it. At about 15 meters away from the path he took, Rowan shot back to my side, immediately dropping the mouthful of dirt he had been pretending not to eat. He's not the smartest. I pet him, and noticed he was standing super alert, staring at the path entrance. When I looked up, I caught a glimpse of the man peeking around the edge of the bushes that concealed the entrance. I stopped dead in my tracks, and Rowan's fur stood on end as he positioned himself in front of me. It took me a second to realize that this man had been watching and waiting in the bushes for me to approach. My current route would have meant that I'd be walking right by the path opening. My stomach dropped as I realized we were the only ones around on that field. I had this weird moment where I was almost trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, but then the guy whistled. Not a wolf whistle, but as if to try and get my dog to come to him. Rowan was having none of that, though, and I definitely took that as my cue to trust my stranger danger instincts. I immediately turned and sped walked back the way we came, simultaneously pulling my phone out and dialing my partner's number. I ended up having to clip on Rowan's lead on to get him to walk with me, and he was not taking his eyes away from the path. He was even growling a little, which was so out of character and put me on edge even more. I glanced back, and the man had edged slightly out of the bushes, watching me walk away. My partner answered the phone after a few rings. I was only halfway through stammering out the story, and he was already sprinting up the field to meet me, telling me to stay on the phone, but to keep an eye on the man. The man in the tracksuit now fully came out of the bushes and just stood staring at me, walking away. I dared a quick look away from him towards the entrance to the field to see my fiancée jogging towards me. He was relieved I was okay, but was also immediately pointing and shouting, "Is that him?" Clearly furious at what this man might have had in his mind had Rowan not picked up on him hiding in the bushes. I eventually convinced my fiancée not to confront him as he was still stood staring, almost taunting us. You never know what people might be capable of, or have concealed. We came off of the field and took Rowan on a different walk, which he was more than happy about. I've never been so proud of him for stepping up and protecting me. Safe to say, he got plenty of treats and fussing when we got home.